1. Trish Holt was about 6 years old when her father happily announced 2 things. She'd got a new baby brother, and she'd finally become an American citizen. More specifically, she was now an official member of the Holt family. Her new name, Trish, would be permanent, forever. And for the rest of her life, she would be reminded how grateful she should be for the privileged life other Korean orphans could only hope for. It was all chance, he said, and she was so fortunate to have been given one. The weight of those announcements didn't make Trish any different from the usual quiet child she had come to be. It turned her into quite the opposite. She'd become even more isolated, closed. The declaration that she was somehow different made it difficult in this harborside town along the New England coast. It was something out of her hands. As a child of 6, she'd come to understand that being different wasn't necessarily a good thing, and when you don't want to fight anyone, you simply join them. And she'd tried to blend in without highlighting her differences. She just wanted to fit in. The problem was, if you have blonde-haired parents with translucent skin and blue eyes, while you have small, winged eyes, dark hair, and yellow skin, you already stand out. And she didn't know real parents and kids had matching hair and eyes until a classmate in school told her so. That's when she knew she was different. She never felt the distinction at home, but she knew some of it had started when her mother had gone to the hospital. When she woke up beside her mother that day, her mother kissed her and shrieked on seeing the river of red on the sheet. It was a scream she'd never forget in her life. As soon as her father heard, he dashed into the room and called the doctor on the phone. Trish was quite alarmed at the panic in their 6-bedroom brick home. She sat in the blood-soaked bed in her pajamas, with her hands covering her ears as her mother's breathing quickened. She watched her father rush down the stairs so fast she could hear the air whip past. "Get your slippers and your favorite dress. Hurry." Her father's usual calm evaporated, and his face turned white. "What's going on? Is Mommy going to die?" Her father's face snapped to her, his eyes so round and forbidding that she was afraid he would slap her like some of the caretakers did at the orphanage. "Do not ever say something like that ever again. I'm taking your mommy to the hospital." "I'm going too?" "No, you'll have to stay with Mrs. Simpson." "Can't I go to Uncle Ben's house?" "Not now, Trish. Hurry up with your things." "No, don't bother. You can change at Mrs. Simpson's place." "Geez, look at you." Trish didn't know what to make of this, but in her childlike mind, she thought her father hated her at that moment. Somehow her mother climbed into the back of the car, her legs all bloody and wet. Her father walked her off to the neighbor's home. Before she could even turn, her father was already in the car seat, and without as much as a backward glance, the car screeched down the road. Mrs. Simpson's home was very old, just like her. The woman barely smiled when she told Trish to sit in the corner like a good girl and not move at all. Trish didn't want to move either because the house had that strange, old people smell. There was a funny-looking bronze horn in the corner. From that horn emerged music, notes rising and falling. It was a magical sound. So Trish craned her neck a little, but the music didn't come from there. Trish slid off the old worn-out paisley couch and drifted in search of it, until she reached a door that was slightly ajar. Mrs. Simpson sat at a giant piano, and the music came from her fingers. Beautiful melodies that made all the panic disappear. It gave her a feeling she couldn't explain. Trish smiled. She'd never heard such music before. Every note made her feel alive and free. Mrs. Simpson suddenly stopped. "I thought I told you to stay put," she said in a stern voice. But it's nothing like I've ever heard," Trish said and pushed the door open. She saw the whole piano, and her eyes widened like an owl. The black shine of the piece and the sounds that came from it amazed her. "Did it really come from here?" she asked with wonder in her voice, awed by the instrument. Trish tilted her head one way and then the other. Mrs. Simpson laughed. Of course it did, silly. Do you like it? Trish sat on the floor and crossed her legs. I love it. I'll stay very still, Mrs. Simpson. You can make music, she said in a hushed voice. Mrs. Simpson seemed pleased with her reverence. All right. I'll play something special for you. Maybe some old jazz. Have you heard of Frank Sinatra? Trish shook her head, mesmerized by the piano and the woman asking her some very serious questions for the first time in her life. Frank Sinatra must be someone really important. He sounded important. Mrs. Simpson sighed. Of course you haven't. Your parents don't seem to be the kind of people who enjoy tasteful music. This one's called Fly Me to the Moon. Trish would never forget that song for the rest of her life. It became her anthem. She listened to it and clapped vigorously when the song was over. Mrs. Simpson was happy to do an encore, but by the end of it was tired. You've worn me out. That's why I never had any kids of my own. Trish learned from guests arriving home that her mommy had a C-section, and their brother had been very sick. He spent a week in the hospital in a special room before they could allow him to come home. Flynn was a sick child and would need a lot of care. That meant Trish had to be a good big sister and not upset Mommy. It also meant that Trish had to be unseen and unheard in the house. "Can't you see I'm busy?" was what she commonly heard from her parents. So during the long, blasted summer, instead of the usual vacation, her parents stayed home with the new baby, and she ran off to Mrs. Simpson. The musty-smelling woman had started giving Trish informal lessons on the piano. This was after she'd caught Trish imitating her while resting one hand on her cross-legged thigh, mouth agape at the melody that emerged from the black. She also learned to stay away from Flynn. The slightest noise from him resulted in a timeout or a scolding. It turned her brother into a vortex, and she stayed on the fringe to avoid falling in. Within months, Flynn grew bigger and his room was filled with stuffed toys and new clothes. He was allowed anything and everything, while the rules were strictly applied to her. And then, with time, Trish saw the differences play out more clearly. Growing up with a sibling had its pitfalls, especially for an adopted child. Flynn always had a big birthday, and his wish was their parents' command. The Holts lived in the Durham neighborhood of New Hampshire, originally populated by Irishmen and Scots, who had fled blight and terror to develop the fishing and curing industries. Today, the Irish heritage still lingered as Durham morphed into a quaint seaside town, with Irish pubs and weekend football. Trish's mother cooked what her own Irish mother had taught her: soda bread, beef stew with Guinness, Dublin caudle with rich creamy potatoes, cabbage pies, succulent chicken dumplings, tasty shepherd's pie, and brack filled with nuts and fruits soaked in overnight whiskey. Trish learned to be an Irish cook. She loved to help her mother because it gave her a sense of closeness to her, a space where Flynn wouldn't encroach, a sacred space. As the summers faded and new winters emerged on the horizon, the situation at home grew testier. Flynn was granted privileges she never enjoyed, and when Trish complained about the differences, she was made to feel like an outsider, someone who had no right to do so given that she was blessed with an opportunity to simply be here. That seemed to be the underlying principle. "How can you complain after everything we've done for you? You're a very lucky child. Any other child in your place would have been happy instead of being jealous of their own brother." But he was not her own, and that had been drilled into her mind time and again. Ridden with guilt for days, Trish would find herself more driven to her music. Mrs. Simpson had allowed her to come on special days to learn, and even gave her a practice book for music theory. She'd not known why the feelings tore at her from the inside, but she was jealous. Jealous of the singular attention focused on Flynn. His antics drove her crazy, and she didn't know how to make it better, but it forced her to compete. No one questioned why Trish started wearing only trousers and shirts, or why she asked for her beautiful glossy mane to be cut short. She got involved in baseball and did everything she could to compete with Flynn as the years passed by. And it wasn't as if Trish was consumed by hatred. She'd worshipped her mother despite it all, enamored with her mother's soft gold locks and her flawless skin. She'd often felt incredibly lucky to have such a beautiful mother. When her classmates often pointed out that her mother had blue eyes, Trish felt proud of her mom. She didn't mind shouting at her classmates, "Yes, that's my mother!" In the meantime, she could only hope that things would one day even out between her brother and her. While it was always said that the Holts loved both their children equally, she knew in her heart that wasn't true. Some late evenings, Trish would drag her Teddy out of bed and join her mother on the couch while she watched a late-night movie. She would burrow into her mother's side and fall asleep there in her rose scent. She was faintly aware of her father picking her up and putting her back into bed. Tears laced her eyes, and as soon as Trish was placed on her bed, she let them wet her pillow. Her mother would still do her hair and buy her new girly clothes, and it made her happy to see her mother enjoy her girliness. She often color-matched her, and those were the happiest days of her childhood. It wasn't always smooth sailing, though. If Trish had played with her mother's lipstick or got a B instead of an A, then her mother would be indifferent and aloof. She'd serve her meals without a word, or leave her at home when they went out, as a punishment. It confused Trish. She didn't understand how she could earn more love at home. Slowly she morphed into a lad, and yet her parents seemed perpetually unhappy with her. Nothing made them as happy as when Flynn sang a song or kicked a ball. Flynn never won a prize, but everything he did was celebrated grandly. Flynn was indulged in everything. Every time he cried or demanded something, they were quick to provide it. And so it continued for years. One particular evening, the Holts decided to accept a dinner invitation to a fancy gala. They'd arranged for Mrs. Simpson to babysit the kids. Except, when the mousy woman arrived, Flynn, who'd turned 4, threw a tantrum that had him breathless and red in the face. To appease him, they promptly carried him to the car and left Trish behind with the woman, who took her back to her house. Trish didn't understand the feelings coursing through her. All she knew was that she was an outsider, someone disposable, someone temporary, and with every year that passed by, she knew she would outserve her purpose. When her parents picked her up later that night, she smiled wide when she saw them. She was half afraid through the evening that they might never come back for her. Of late, that feeling of being sent away again had taken possession of her mind. "Did Mrs. Simpson give you a snack?" "No," she told her father. "Didn't you leave instructions for Mrs. Simpson?" her father said rather forcefully, as he went to the cupboard and fished out the cereal. "She wasn't supposed to be at her place. I wanted her to babysit here." "That's no excuse for her starving. We should have bought her something," he said, as his eyes zeroed in on Flynn running around with the kitty meal toy. Trish didn't stare at the toy. She was too old to ask for something like that. She knew better. As soon as the bowl was placed before her, she started eating her cereal and milk. In her heart, somewhere, hurt wedged upwards. But she was grateful, she reminded herself. Lots of children in the orphanages didn't have a bed, nice clothes, and a lovely home like her. She got to go to school and play the piano, something she'd been doing very often now for 4 years. "She's not that little," her mother said. "Just leave her be." The bias struck her deep in her soul. Trish quietly munched her cereal, hoping to hear a rejoinder from her father. It never came. "I think we had a good night," her mother said, as if Trish wasn't even in the room. Her father didn't reply. He just waited for Trish to finish her cereal. Mechanically, he washed her bowl and spoon and walked out of the room. A few days later, Trish dreaded handing the circular her Sunday school teacher gave her mother as she picked her up from school. "It's for you." "What is it now? Can't it wait, Trish?" Cindy Holt had one hand on the steering wheel and another wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee. Trish waited and bit her lip, her mother busy maneuvering her way out of the rotunda. Parents were all in a haste to zip their way home. Impatiently, her mother sighed. Why don't you tell me instead, darling? The smile from Trish's lips came unbidden. I need a costume for the talent show. Cindy only spoke when they stopped at the traffic light. After a quick glance at the road, she took the paper from her hand and read it. 3 weeks to get you ready and a costume? Is this compulsory? Trish shook her head. Miss Pippin says everyone has to have some talent. She so wanted to participate, and the talent show didn't cost any money. As far as her costume was concerned, she could wear her usual clothes. It was no big deal. She had it all figured out. Her mother closed her eyes and pressed the bridge of her nose. I don't have the energy to deal with this. Why do they always do this and spring things on parents at the last minute, as if we don't have enough to do with all the normal homework? Trish covered her mother's hand with her own small one. You don't have to train me. I'll get ready all by myself. But somebody will have to buy you clothes and practice whatever it is you plan to do. She pressed the call button to her husband. Her father picked up on the third ring. He sounded worn out and seemed distracted. Oliver Holt was so busy making the big bucks as an executive for a hotel chain that it was a wonder they ever saw him. He'd often return long after the children slept and woke up after they'd gone to school. Even while he was at home, he was always glued to his computer or dealing with emergency issues at the hotel. Trish couldn't remember the last time he'd asked about her friends' names, favorite food, or even which grade she was in. So it came as a shock to her when her mother said, You'll need to train Trish for her talent show. Why can't you do it? He volleyed back. She yelled over a blaring horn. I'm taking Flynn to play school. It's hard enough to get him adapted to a new bunch of kids. Either way, I'll be gone for most of the day. His voice sounded angry now. Cindy, how can you dump this on me? How should I do it? I don't know, her mother said, as she sped up after the light turned green, past the road resplendent with green, velvety plants. Can't we just say she's not talented enough or too nervous? What did you just say? All right, I'll see what I can do. So you'll coach her through her act and do her costume? Her mother clarified. You're not giving me a choice, he said, slightly annoyed. Her mother hung up. She was truly giving Oliver no room to escape. When her father got home in the evening, it was late. She was already tucked into bed. Her ears preened, though, waiting for the heavy thud of her father's footsteps. He finally opened the door to her room, and she sat up. Do you know what you're going to do for the talent show, Trish? Yes, Daddy. Very well, let's hear it. I'm going to play Fly Me to the Moon by Frank Sinatra. Her father blinked at her. I'm sorry, what did you say? You know this song. Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Trish sang in her best voice. I know the song, and I'm wondering how you know it. He paused and waited for her answer. Mrs. Simpson taught me on her piano, and I'm going to play it for the talent show. Are you sure? That's not an easy song. I might even have it on a jazz CD, he said, walking back to the living room. He returned with 2 CDs, glancing at the playlist at the back. No, Daddy, I'm sure. I want to play that song. Why? I just have to. Trish had loved that song from the moment she heard it. The song seemed to be her motto, to fly somewhere far and live among the stars, to be loved and to be told that someone loved her. She became fascinated by that song. She thought of becoming an astronaut, but her love for the piano and the feel of her fingers making magic with the keys just didn't compare. The next evening, her father took her to a shop with keyboards and said, Show me the song you're going to play. The shopkeeper, on seeing her enthusiasm, let her use a 4-octave keyboard on display. She turned it on, tested a few keys, and started with a few jazzy beats before launching into the song with nimble fingers and singing it as best she could. She took in her father's rapt gaze, and soon she had a crowd, which only prompted her to lend more pizzazz to the piece. Trish flew through the song, light on emotion and quick with the beat. When she finished the piece, a dozen claps rang out, and her father had tears in his eyes. "My goodness, Trish, how long have you been practicing?" "4 years," she said. "Did you like it?" "Like it? I loved it." "That kid's a prodigy," the shopkeeper said. "Do you want to be a pianist when you grow up?" She shook her head. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" Her father's eyebrow pleaded. "It won't be easy, you know. It won't make you very rich unless you're very good." "Then I'm going to get good, aren't I?" "The best," he said. And not only did he buy her the first keyboard of her life and a pedal, he also bought her a small chain with a pendant of a treble clef. Trish considered that the best day of her life. She wasn't allowed to wear it to school, but she showed it off to all her friends when they came for a sleepover. No one else had one like it. She hung it near her bed and saw it every night before she slept, and first thing when she woke up in the morning. When her father took her out for a piano concert one evening, she wore it with her pretty blue dress, and he smiled down at her after it was over. She'd been mesmerized by the concert, clapping so loudly when the piece was over that her father had to stop her with his big hands. That night she carefully removed her pendant and hung it back reverently by her bed when she returned home. So the next day, when she came back from baseball practice, she was quite bummed at having been benched. Small cotton clouds cloaked the fiery orange sky. Still in her helmet and uniform, she stormed up to her room only to hear the jarring sounds of her keyboard, as if someone was banging the keys. She edged the door open to see Flynn dangling something before her eyes. It shone in the late afternoon sunlight. Trish flew into a rage. "You're not supposed to be here, and you shouldn't touch my keyboard." Trish was furious. "Go away!" Flynn stuck his tongue defiantly, swinging her pendant and flinging it to the floor, following which he proceeded to stomp it with much gusto. Trish shoved him hard, causing him to hit his head against the edge of the small bedside table. Flynn started crying, and an unseemly gash opened in his forehead. A steady stream of red flowed, and Trish bent down to pick up her broken pendant. "Serves you right for touching someone else's things." Hearing the commotion, her mother charged into the room. "My goodness, Flynn, you're bleeding. What did you do, Trish?" "Me? Ask him what he's doing here. This is my room. He touched my keyboard without my permission, and he broke my pendant," she said with pent-up rage. "It's no big deal, Trish. Goodness, he's gushing," she breathed, and tried to stem the bleeding with tissues. Flynn sobbed. "Trish was mean to me. She pushed me." Trish fired back. "You broke my pendant." "Enough of that, Trish. I'll get you another one." "No, I don't want another one. Daddy gave me that one. It won't be the same." "Shut up, will you? I'm going to take him to the doctor. For your sake, I hope he doesn't need any stitches." "I don't care about him. I hope he gets stitches. That'll teach him not to touch other people's stuff without permission." Her mother was clearly distressed. "That's enough, you hear me? You're being ungrateful. I can't imagine you being so selfish after everything you have. Other adopted children don't have it as good as you." If her mother would have smacked her, that wouldn't have hurt as much. Trish stood there, sadly reminded that she wasn't their child. That in truth, she didn't have a mother or father. She was a guest, temporarily living off someone's charity. She was an inconvenience. Trish sat huddled on her bed in the corner and laid the two halves of her treble clef. Swallowing back her tears, she stared at the sun. That day, Trish decided she was going to make her own family, find someone who would love her. She'd have to escape from here first. When her father came home in the evening, she stayed under the covers and didn't eat her dinner. Even when he tried to shake her to wake her up, she closed her eyes shut until she heard her father sigh and leave. Her pillow was wet with tears. A month later, on her 11th birthday, she informed her father what Mrs. Simpson told her about learning music at the Purcell School of Music. He was stunned. "That school is in London. Do you really need to study music so far away? But the grief and the craving for love had grown in her. Maybe she'd find someone else to love her while she was at school, or later in college. She wasn't loved or even wanted here. She practiced day and night almost obsessively, and finally, when she got past her auditions and received admission, it seemed like she'd achieved something. Her father had repeatedly asked her why she wanted to go. "Trish, I hope it has nothing to do with what your mother said. She can get a little overprotective of Flynn." Trish simply smiled. "I'm going to be the best pianist in the world, Daddy." "I'm sure you are, Munchkin. You do know that Daddy loves you, don't you?" "Yes," she said, with tears lacing her eyes, because it wasn't enough, and it was much less than what would be reserved for his real child. From then on, Trish relied on her music. When she felt sad or happy, lonely or hurt, her piano became her comfort, and it made her fly away to the solace of that place where no one could hurt her.